In a previous video I talked to you about a Hoover portable so-called suitcase cleaner that I owned and explained the features of it, and also I stated that it wasn't very practical to use. Although it was a good idea and it looked nice, it wasn't very practical. Well, now I want to show you a machine that is really practical and a really good machine. Allow me to introduce to you the Hoover Constellation. Probably one of the best Hoover cylinder cleaners they ever made. Now I say cylinder, I know it's not a cylinder, it's a pot, but it came into the cylinder category. Now just for a little bit of history, originally Hoover mainly stuck to making the so-called upright machines right up until the Second World War, and after the Second World War they did start to make so-called cylinder machines. Now there were two main makers of vacuum cleaners at the time and after the war. Mainly that was Electrolux and Hoover. There were others like Goblin and various other companies that dabbled, but they were never really big like Hoover and Electrolux. Now Hoover was known for upright machines, they always were the best upright machines, and Electrolux was known for their cylinder machines. And to be fair, the Electrolux cylinder machines were better than the Hoover ones, I believe. After the war, in 1947, Hoover brought their first real cylinder cleaner out, and that's the model 402. As you can see in this manual, this is the model 402. It's a very heavy and cumbersome machine. It was very well built, I must say. It was a devil to repair, we hated doing them. And they made this machine right up until about 1953. The suction wasn't anything to write home about, but because it was fairly heavy construction, it was quite heavy. It was well built, obviously, and it worked. And a lot of these were still working well into the late 60s and early 70s. The next model they brought out was the 417. Now this is the 417 cleaner. This is in the service manual. You can see a picture of the 417 here. There was various versions of it, the original 417 right up to the very latest one, which was the 417G. Now the 417 was a really nice, well built machine. It was all metal. There was virtually nothing plastic on it, it was all metal. Unfortunately, suction was pretty pathetic. I mean, nowadays you look at it and you think, well, actually I wish I had one of those, because compared to the stuff made today, it's superb quality and everything, but in its time the suction was very poor. And but they continued making this machine right up into the early 70s, I believe, and it was a very reliable machine. Now, going back to the Constellation, this is where things changed. Now, this is a model 867A, which is one of the last versions that they made, and they continued making this one for many, many years, right up until modern times, really. And I think it's a great shame they stopped doing it, because I think they're brilliant machines. The first UK built Constellation came out in 1956, and that was the 822 model. The early version had a 510 watt motor. It was basically the same as that fitted to the old 417 machine, the early 417s that is. In 1957, about a year later, they brought out a later model of the 822, which was virtually the same, but it had one main difference. It had what they called airlift. That is, they advertised it that it floated on the air. Now, when I say floated on the air, it did actually float in a manner. It had airlift. It didn't float like a hovercraft. It didn't fly about the room, but when you pulled it along by the hose pipe, it would sort of follow you, providing the floor wasn't too bumpy, and it assisted it when it pulled along. So it didn't have wheels and that like a lot of machines had. It had this so-called airlift. Well, that was in 1957. That model, the early one, still had the old 417 motor in it with the single winding. Now in 1958, another year later, they brought out the 822A. Now this one had the new style motor as fitted in this particular Constellation, and they upped the rating to 580 watts, and that was much better. Now those early Constellations, as you can see from the picture here, they were quite different to the later model, and in actual fact at the time when I was involved in repairing them, I never liked them. They had a great big cumbersome hose assembly, and I always thought they were unseemly things. They were a bit cumbersome and difficult to carry about and that. But looking at them now, actually, I wish I'd kept one, because I quite like them. And I didn't like them before. I always liked the later model. I thought it was much nicer, but now I've changed my mind. And I've thrown away loads of these old 822As, and I wish I'd kept one anyway, because I think they're quite nice now. So now we come to the 862. Now the 862, that one came out in 1960, and it had the same 580 watt motor as the 822A. The 862 came with this new plastic handle on the top, which incidentally used to break, but you could replace them anyway. And it had a better hose fitting. The hose, this is the hose, and it's simply clipped in there like that. I'll come on to the hose in a minute. I'll just carry on telling you a bit about the history. I know it's a bit long-winded. Anyway, that was the 862. That came out in 1960, and it was made for quite a few years. And then in 1965, they uprated it a little bit, and they called it the 867A, which was basically the same thing, but it had a motor. Not all of them, but the later models had a motor with a plastic top on it, and it was uprated to 600 watts. But basically it was the same thing, apart from the slightly different motor with different brush holders and things. In 1975 there was a Model 858, but this wasn't a UK made version. This was one imported from the US. Due to a strike at the Hoover factory, they imported some machines from America, and the Constellation 858 was one of them. It was in a sort of tangerine cover. The top was tangerine and the bottom was a kind of a taupe browny sort of colour as far as I remember, but we didn't actually see many of them. They were quite rare. There was also a commercial version of the Constellation that was offered by contract or rental department. These were basically the same as the standard domestic model. The only difference really was that they had a heavy duty braided hose pipe rather than the double stretch one as used on the domestic models. The hose was rather cumbersome to use as well, very awkward to use. It had rubber buffers at various points along the hose to sort of protect it, but the double stretch hose was much easier to use. This hose was rather heavy and cumbersome. The only other difference was that it had an inner cloth bag rather than paper bags. Hotels and places such like wouldn't like to spend their money on paper bags. I do remember that we had a spare inner cloth bag in our stores, and it remained in there for about 30 years, and I don't think we ever sold it. I think it got thrown away eventually because there were so few commercial Constellations in use. I have failed to mention one other Hoover because I'm not that interested in it, but there was a Constellation that they produced around about 2006. It was sold as a retro model, and it was a mere shadow of this. It was wrong to use the name Constellation, I believe, because although it was round, it didn't bear any resemblance whatsoever to the quality of these Constellations. It was a sort of cheaply made thing, and the tools and that were all plastic, and they didn't last very long. They were very poor quality. The motor was a cheap motor, and you can't really compare it with these at all, so I shouldn't really mention it, I don't think. Okay, so now back to the cleaner itself. This is the later model, the 867A, and it's a fairly basic machine. You basically got an on-off switch down here, a hose connection goes in there, and there's a little clip at the back here where you open the top up. It's very simple and basic, but it does one thing really, really good, and that is it's got very good suction, and I will plug it in a moment and show you. Now, compared to modern machines, it's got no flashing lights, no computers, no microchips, nothing like that. And in my opinion, that's what makes it brilliant, because you don't need it. Most of these gadgets they put on modern machines, they only go wrong, and most people never use them. All these variable speed controls, electronic controls that vary the speed of the motor, most people have it on maximum speed, maximum suction nearly all the time, and they very rarely get used, and quite often they go wrong, and then it's an expensive job to put it right. And of course with modern machines, you're lucky if you can even buy the spares, let alone afford to mend it, because even if parts are available, the price is so prohibitive that most people just chuck it away and buy you a new one. A lot of the vacuum cleaners are now made in China, and they're so cheap, they're imported so cheap that if you get a problem with them under guarantee and you phone up the manufacturer, they just say, oh well, we'll send you a new one if you can just dispose of the old one, and it's just thrown away. I mean, it's wicked really, isn't it, in this day and age of saving the planet. We should be saving these things, not and repairing them, not dumping them. Anyway, that's the end of my lecture. Let's get back to the Constellation. What I'll do first, I'll plug it in, and then you can have a listen to it and see how good it is. Well, I think it's good. There we go. I'll just plug it in. Switching on. Oops, it's already switched on though. Now this one, that's interesting that, because I'm going to lift that up and make you see it. There's a little switch. It's got what we call, it's a delayed action switch. These switches used to develop that problem. These, you'd switch it one way or the other and it didn't actually make contact, and it's what we call a double click. Yeah, see, I turn it off and it hasn't gone off. If you fiddle with it, it will. If you do get one of these switches, which gives you this double action click or delayed action click, don't just chuck it or get a new switch. All you got to do is just spray a little bit of WD-40 it down through the switch lever and flick it about a few times, and you'll find that it'll go back to working normally. It just get a bit sticky, so sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But as I say, it's not really a problem. WD-40 is sort that, or switch cleaner. Anyway, so that's the thing. Now you can see the suction. You hear that lot? Masses of suction. Oops. Masses of suction. More than you'd need. And no gadgets, no electronics, no flashing lights, everything. Now when it comes to emptying the bag, I'll just turn it round here. Simple job. Undo that little clip. Lift the handle back. And there's the paper bag. Now this one's got a clip on there, so of course in the old days people didn't throw the bag away, they emptied it. I mean, they wouldn't buy a machine if you had to put a new bag in every time. That was too expensive. They want a machine where you could reuse the bag, and sensibly too. I do that. And there's the bag fitted, a genuine Hoover bag with the original bag clip look, and it just simply slides in there. One of the problems with this particular one is the bags did have a cardboard fitting, and after a time it gets a bit floppy and it sometimes slips in. So what I do with mine, I put a bit of tape on them in the workshop, because I use one in the workshop. I'll show you that one in a minute. I mean, in regular use you'd change the bag anyway, so it probably wouldn't get like that. Another important thing to notice, in the top here there's this little rubber seal. Now it's important to make sure it's that way round, because a lot of people put it that way for some reason, which is the wrong way round, because that rubber flange on there has to sit on that bag there to seal it. If you don't, you'll get dust blowing all around here. So that goes on like that, so that's one thing to remember. Now, as for filters, this is the filter. And as you can see, it's just simply a circle of felt with a metal clip round it, and to clean it off you just undo the clip. I'm not taking this one off because it's clean anyway. You can see it's practically new. You just take the clip off and then give it a good clean out and pop it back on. What could be simpler? No expensive filters. A lot of these modern machines have got these special filters and HEPA filters and all this nonsense that cost the earth to replace. This is simple and straightforward, and you know, it just works just fine basically. Now I'm just going to pop the bag back in for a moment because I want to show you underneath. I'm showing you all these things because some people are interested in seeing it. I'll just turn him over there. Now you'll notice in the bottom you've got another hole here where you can actually fit the hose into, and then you can use the machine as a blower. Not many modern machines do that, do they? And this is where the air comes out and gives you the floating action of the machine, so that when you're using it, it tends to blow the air out there and follows you around. The only thing you have to be careful of is that it will blow any dust out. So if you've got it, if you're doing the machine, I know somebody once, not me, it wasn't nothing to do with me, but I know somebody repaired one, and there's a lot of carbon dust inside, and they left the little filter out in the bottom. They switched it on, and all the carbon dust was blown out and left a circle on the carpet, and the customer wasn't too delighted, I can tell you. And that can happen. This is the Hoover double stretch hose that Hoover used at the time on all their cylinder vacuum cleaners, or pop vacuum cleaners, what you want to call them. Now, actual fact, this isn't a genuine Hoover one. It's a genuine Hoover end, and that's probably genuine Hoover, but the hose isn't, because it's one of these with these easy fit cuffs. Hoover didn't do these, but we used to fit these on. We called these Bojack or pattern hoses, because they were much easier to fit, because basically all you did was shove a bit of glue on there and shove the end of the hose in there, and the job was done. With the Hoover ones, it was a really awkward job. You had to prise this cover off, and then inside the actual hose was glued onto the thing, and then you put some raffeta around it to hold it on, some twine or some raffeta, and then you had to slide the sleeve out, and it was a hell of a job to do. These were so easy that if a customer brought one in the shop and wanted a new hose, we could do it while they waited. You know, it only took a few seconds to put a new hose on. We had them behind the counter and did it straight away, whereas a Hoover hose, you'd have had to left it with us. But they were quite a good thing actually, these double stretch hoses. Anyway, I just wanted to show you this other one. Now this is one I use in my workshop. This is the same 867 model, it's a different colour because it's a slightly earlier one. It's slightly earlier, but it's still an 867A. And I'm just going to plug it in so you can have a listen to it because it sounds different to that one, and then I'll show you why. There's two reasons actually. See, it's a bit softer. Still good suction though. Pretty good suction. Now there's two reasons why it sounds a bit softer. First reason is that it's got a different motor, an earlier motor, an all metal one. The earlier one, the first one I showed you, has a plastic bodied top on the motor. But the main reason why it's quieter is because it's all clogged up. Because look at this. This is what I meant about the bag flange, you see. See how I've held this on with tape and this is all convoluted. The reason is that I use this machine in my belt sander and it sends off very fine powder dust, and that's the worst thing possible for a vacuum cleaner because it really clogs the bag up. You can see it's all, this bag is absolutely chock-a-block with it, and you can see it's all blown around here. It's very, very fine powder off the sanding, and that soon clogs it up, and you can see how clogged up the machine is, and that's the reason why it sounds a bit slower. But once that's all cleaned up again, it'll be fine. Now what I'm going to do, as I've got this one, the top open, I'll show you inside this one first. To service these machines, it is absolutely a piece of cake. It's probably the easiest machine ever to service. So where's my big screwdriver? I've got my screwdriver, and by the way, this is a genuine Hoover screwdriver. It's actually made by Stanley, but it was made specially Hoover, and it's made specially long like that. It's for repairing Hoover 1334 upright vacuum cleaners, and you needed it to get right down to the motor. I don't know why I'm telling you that, because it's got no relevance whatsoever to this, but that's what I'm using anyway. Right, there are 3 screws on here. Some of the earlier models had 4, but basically there are 3 screws. 3 self-tapping screws. Number 1. Now watch how quick I can get to the motor. Number 2 and number 3. Right. That's the 3 screws out, and then lift the top off. There's the top, look, with all the dust. I'll put that out of the way a minute. And there you've got the inside of the machine. And as you can see, there's basically nothing to it. You've got your motor here. You can just lift that out, look, and you can see into the bottom of the machine down here. There's a rubber mounting. This is the little port where the air goes out that gives you the lifting action, and you'll notice there's no filter in there. That's deliberate. It's because I use it on my workshop machine and I didn't want a filter in there, so I took it out. The switch is mounted here. To get that switch out, there's just one little clip. You put a screwdriver in there, the 2 clips fall apart, the switch falls straight out. Piece of cake. You could change that switch in minutes. And down here you've got the terminal block, which is quite straightforward. Piece of cake to change the flex, far easier than any modern machine. I mean, it's brilliant actually to repair. But basically that's it. Now I'm not going to take any more of that apart because I've actually got a motor here to show you. This is the motor out of that particular type of machine, and it's just the standard Hoover motor. This is the same motor they fitted in the later Hoover 417. There you can see the suppressor on it. I won't take the motor apart because I've done motors before and it's not very exciting anyway. The joy of these machines, back in the 70s and early 80s, every single part of this was available. You could buy any part you wanted. Today, you're lucky to get anything. I mean, if you can get a pair of carbon brushes for a motor, you're doing well, because they're not interested in spares. The stuff's imported cheaply from China, and it's basically a couple of years, throw it away. Most of the things are battery operated now. Batteries last 2 years and cost more than the cleaner, so they sling it away. It's awful. It really is awful. It saddens me. There's the motor, look. That's the actual motor that we've got here. That's this motor. And as you can see, every single part of that motor was available. This is dated 1966, by the way, but this was still, all these spares were still available right up into the late 70s, no problem. And you've got even the bearing in this plate was separate, look. And all the fans and the nuts, bolts, screws, the bits of sleeving, you name it, it was available. You don't get that today. You're lucky if you can get a motor. So that's the earlier type motor. I think these were the best ones. I like these the best of all. The later 867 had this motor, which had a plastic body. As you can see, it's basically, it fits in exactly the same, and they are actually interchangeable. You can change them round. It fits exactly the same like that. There's a rubber buffer on there. The only difference mainly, apart from that, it's got a plastic top. The carbon brush holders are built into the top, and they're not as good as the ones on this one, where you can actually, you can take these brush holders completely, just a screw in there. Look, it's even got Hoover stamped on the brush holder, which is nice. And you can change the brushes simply just by loosening that screw and twisting it round, the brush comes out. Anyway, I won't take it all apart because there's not much point really. I have done motor dismantling in some of my other videos. There's quite a few videos where I've taken motors apart, and they are quite straightforward and easy to do. The only problem today, of course, is being able to get spare parts for them. But frankly, I think these are a brilliant machine and very underrated. It's probably, in my opinion, it's the best Hoover cylinder they have ever made. Now, a lot of people like the modern machines. I don't. I've never been a fan. My Hoover interests died really with the end of these machines, and same with the uprights. I'm mostly interested in the metal-bodied machines. Once they went over to all plastic, like for example the Hoover Sensatronics and the compacts and things, I've never had any affection for those whatsoever. You know, they're not in the same league as that. I don't think so. Sadly, the days of Hoover being a top quality UK company have now gone, and the Hoover name is no longer what it once was. Back in the 1960s, I first started getting involved with Hoover around 1964, and I was a young man. You wouldn't think that looking at me now, would you? But I was very keen, and I was very loyal to Hoover, and I loved the company. I thought they were wonderful. But sadly, in the late 1970s, early 80s, all that changed, and they went, in my opinion, they went downhill. And of course, eventually, they had the airfares fiasco, which I mentioned in another video. And the Hoover company in the US sold the Hoover parent company in the US sold the UK division to Candy, an Italian company, and now I think they've sold off the vacuum cleaner section to a Chinese company, and they're all made in China. They don't have anything as far as I'm concerned. I'm only interested in the older Hoovers. I'm not interested at all in the modern plastic ones. They're meaningless as far as I'm concerned. Well, I think that's about it for now on the Constellation. I think it's a wonderful machine. It's got no bells and whistles, no gadgets, no pointless electrical gadgets that you don't need. It just works, it does its job, and it works well. And I think it's a great shame that somebody don't make a machine like this now. There is one machine on the market that is comparable in a way, but I don't have the same affection for it, and that's the one made by Pneumatic, which they call the Henry machine. It is similar to this in that it's round, but it doesn't bear any resemblance to Constellation. It's mainly a plastic body on it, but at least it looks a bit like it, and they are made in the UK, so I would recommend that as a replacement for the Constellation. Anyway, thanks very much for watching. Bye for now.